Sometimes life does not announce its turning points with grand gestures or dramatic music swelling in the background. Sometimes it slips them quietly into the folds of an ordinary afternoon. The kind of day that begins like every other and gives no hint that it will be remembered long after countless others are forgotten. And Margaret had always believed she had already lived through all her important chapters. That by the age of 67, the story of her heart had settled into its final shape, predictable, and gently fading like ink on an old page. Because grief has a way of convincing you that the future is meant only for maintenance, not discovery, and so she moved through her days with the steady rhythm of routine, waking early out of habit rather than necessity, making tea in the same chipped blue mug she had used for decades, opening the curtains to the same quiet street where the trees had grown taller but the world otherwise felt unchanged. And in those moments, she often felt her late husband's presence, not as pain anymore, but as a soft echo. A familiar silence that had learned to live beside her rather than against her. And she told herself that this was enough, that contentment did not have to be loud to be real. Yet, even as she believed it, she could feel something inside her slowly thinning. Like a muscle no longer used, a place that once held excitement, curiosity, and the sense of being seen. And that place had grown quiet not because she wanted it to, but because she assumed it was simply how aging worked. That the heart learned to rest rather than reach. And on the morning everything began, she had no intention of challenging that belief. Because she woke, dressed, and stepped out into the cool air with the simple goal of running errands. Returning a book to the library, buying groceries, perhaps stopping by the small independent bookstore, 2 streets down that she had visited so often. The owner greeted her by name. And there was comfort in knowing exactly how the afternoon would unfold. Because predictability felt like safety, and safety had become her definition of peace after loss. Yet fate has a way of disguising itself as clumsiness or coincidence. And as Margaret reached for a stack of books from a low shelf in the store, her fingers slipped, the pile tipping forward in a slow, humiliating cascade that sent paperbacks and hardcovers scattering across the wooden floor. The sound louder than she expected, drawing glances from a few nearby customers, and she felt the familiar flush of embarrassment rise in her cheeks as she bent to gather them, her knees protesting slightly as they always did, when another pair of hands entered her field of vision, moving quickly but gently, collecting the books with ease, and a voice, warm and unhurried, said, "I think the books staged a small rebellion," and she laughed before she could stop herself. Surprised by the sound of it, surprised that it still existed so easily. And when she looked up she saw a man she did not recognize, younger than her by decades, with kind eyes and an expression that held curiosity rather than pity. And he handed her the last book with a small smile that felt genuine rather than polite. And she thanked him, expecting that to be the end of it, a brief kindness between strangers. But instead he glanced at the titles in her hands and said, "You have excellent taste," and something about the way he said it invited conversation rather than ending it. And before she knew it, they were standing between the shelves talking about novels, about authors who had shaped them, about how certain stories felt different depending on the season of life in which you read them, and she found herself saying things she had not spoken aloud in years. Reflections about teaching literature, about watching students discover themselves through words, about how books had once been her greatest companions when the house felt too quiet after her husband passed. And he listened, truly listened, not checking his phone, not glancing away, but meeting her thoughts with thoughtful responses, sharing his own love for stories, his belief that books were conversations across time. And she felt something stir inside her that was unfamiliar now, a sense of being engaged rather than merely acknowledged. And when the bookstore owner announced an upcoming reading event, he suggested they both attend, casually, without pressure, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And Margaret hesitated, aware suddenly of the age difference, of the assumptions that might follow, of the invisible rules she had learned to live by since becoming a widow. rules that said companionship should be safe, familiar, and and yet something in her resisted the idea of dismissing the moment entirely. So she smiled and said she would think about it, expecting him to politely move on. But instead he nodded as though that answer was enough, wished her a good afternoon, and left, and she stood there longer than necessary, holding her books as though they had gained weight, her heart beating faster than she could logically explain. And as she walked home, she tried to label the feeling as harmless, as flattery, as curiosity, anything other than what it felt like, which was possibility. And that frightened her more than she cared to admit, because possibility suggested choice, and choice suggested responsibility for her own happiness. And she had grown accustomed to believing happiness was something that had already happened to her, rather than something she could still seek. And that night she dreamed of her husband, not with sorrow, but with warmth, remembering the way he used to encourage her to say yes to experiences even when they scared her. And she woke with a strange mix of guilt and lightness, as though she had briefly stepped into a version of herself she thought no longer existed. And in the days that followed, she tried to return to her routine. But small cracks had formed in it, moments where her thoughts drifted back to the bookstore, to the sound of laughter between shelves, to the realization that conversation could still surprise her. And when the day of the reading arrived, she stood in front of her mirror longer than usual, adjusting her scarf, smoothing her hair, telling herself she was being ridiculous, that this was just a public event, nothing more. Yet, when she arrived and saw him there, already seated, looking genuinely pleased to see her, something settled in her chest. Not excitement exactly, but recognition. The quiet sense that a door had opened and she was standing on the threshold, unsure whether she would step through, but suddenly aware that it existed. And as the reading unfolded and they exchanged whispered comments and smiles, Margaret felt herself waking in small, careful ways, noticing colors more vividly, laughter more fully, and as they walked out together into the evening air, talking not about the future, but about the moment, she realized that the most surprising thing was not his presence but her own. The way she felt grounded, yet alive, cautious, yet curious. And she understood then that this was not a betrayal of her past, but an expansion of it, though she was not yet ready to name it as such. And so she told herself, as she said goodnight and walked home alone beneath a sky streaked with fading light, that it was simply a friendship beginning, that there was no need to fear something she had not even allowed herself to imagine, unaware that her life had already begun to quietly, irrevocably change. In the weeks that followed, Margaret told herself she was simply allowing life to unfold without expectation. That meeting Ethan again was not an event but an extension of a pleasant conversation that had already proven its worth. And so when they began running into each other with increasing frequency, first at the library where he waved from across the room as if seeing her there made perfect sense, then at a small cafe near the park where he happened to be reading at the corner table and invited her to join him, she framed it in her mind as coincidence rather than intention, though some quieter part of her understood that coincidence often requires participation. And she found herself lingering longer than usual after errands, choosing routes that passed familiar places where he might be, not because she expected anything from him, but because her days felt fuller when conversation interrupted them, and they spoke easily, about things both large and small, about the strange comfort of routine and the quiet ache of dreams deferred, about the ways grief changes shape rather than disappearing. And Ethan never rushed her stories or softened his curiosity out of politeness. Instead, he asked questions that suggested he wanted to understand rather than merely listen. And this surprised her because she had grown used to being treated gently in a way that made her feel fragile, as if age and loss had rendered her something to be handled with care rather than engaged with honestly. But Ethan spoke to her as if her experiences were not relics but living things, relevant and valuable, and in his presence she felt neither old nor young, only present, and slowly their meetings began to take on a rhythm, Coffee on Tuesday mornings, when the cafe was quiet and the light filtered softly through the windows. Museum visits where they walked side by side, sometimes talking animatedly about art and sometimes falling into companionable silence. Library lectures where they exchanged knowing looks during particularly insightful moments. And Margaret noticed how these shared experiences began to stitch themselves into her life, filling spaces she had not consciously acknowledged as empty. And when she returned home after seeing him, the house felt different. Not louder or less lonely, but touched somehow, as though it had briefly remembered what anticipation felt like. And she caught herself smiling while washing dishes or sorting mail. Small, unguarded expressions of contentment that startled her because they arrived without effort. And her friends noticed too, though she did not initially understand how visible the change had become. Until one afternoon during a weekly lunch, she was met with raised eyebrows and gentle teasing. Comments about her energy, the way she seemed lighter, more animated, and when one of them asked, half joking and half curious, if there was someone new in her life, Margaret laughed it off, brushing the question aside, insisting that nothing had changed, and yet as she spoke she realized how unconvincing she sounded even to herself. Because something had changed, though it was not yet something she could easily name, and that realization brought with it an undercurrent of unease. Because change suggested movement, and movement required intention. And she had lived for several years, now without allowing herself to want anything that might complicate her carefully balanced life. And guilt began to creep in quietly, not as a sharp accusation, but as a persistent whisper, reminding her of the vows she had once taken, the love she had shared with her husband, the years they had built together, and she wondered whether joy was something she was still entitled to seek, or whether it was meant now to be remembered rather than pursued. And this internal conflict grew louder after she mentioned Ethan to her daughter, Claire, in what she intended to be a casual remark, a simple observation about a friend she had made. But Claire's reaction was immediate and layered, concern flickering across her face before she masked it with practicality. Questions about who he was, how old he was, how they met. And Margaret found herself answering defensively, insisting that it was nothing serious, that she was not being foolish. And Claire nodded but did not entirely hide her unease, eventually voicing the thought she had clearly been holding back, asking gently but firmly whether Margaret was sure this was wise, reminding her of the age difference, the potential for misunderstanding, the risk of heartbreak. And though Claire's concern was born of love, it landed heavily, reinforcing Margaret's own doubts. And that night she lay awake longer than usual, replaying conversations, examining her feelings as though they were evidence in a case she needed to argue both for and against. And she thought about her husband, about how deeply he had loved her, how he had always wanted her to feel alive rather than preserved. And she imagined what he might say now, whether he would encourage caution or courage. And she realized with a quiet clarity that what frightened her most was not the possibility of being hurt, but the possibility of wanting something again. Because wanting opens the door to loss, and she had learned the cost of loss too well. And yet, despite these thoughts, she did not pull away. She did not cancel plans or create distance. Instead, she allowed their friendship to continue deepening, perhaps because it did not yet demand definition. And in that undefined space, she felt safe enough to explore connection without labeling it. And Ethan, for his part, never pressured her for more, never framed their time together as anything other than what it was. Moments shared without expectation, and this patience reassured her, making it easier to trust that whatever was forming between them was built on mutual respect rather than imbalance. And they spoke openly about their lives, Ethan sharing stories of his own disappointments, relationships that had taught him what he wanted and what he did not, his appreciation for authenticity, his belief that connection mattered more than chronology. And Margaret found herself offering insights she had gained over a lifetime, reflections about compromise, about choosing kindness even in moments of conflict. about how love evolves rather than diminishes. And she was surprised by how much she enjoyed being someone others learned from rather than someone they worried about. And as these exchanges accumulated, something within her settled. A growing understanding that joy was not a betrayal of memory but a continuation of it. That honoring the love she had known did not require her to live in its shadow. And still, uncertainty remained, woven through her happiness like a thin thread of tension. Because she could sense that the world would not necessarily see their connection the way she did. And she was not yet sure whether she was strong enough to face that scrutiny. And so she existed in a careful balance, savoring each meeting while telling herself not to look too far ahead, unaware that life rarely allows us to remain indefinitely in the space between before and after, as the weeks turned into months. The space between Margaret and Ethan quietly transformed from something tentative into something lived in. A connection that no longer felt like a fragile experiment, but rather a presence that naturally belonged in her days. And this shift became most apparent when he first came to her house. An invitation she had debated internally for far longer than she admitted. Because her home was not just a place, but a museum of memory. Every corner carrying echoes of a life once shared. Yet when Ethan stepped inside, he did so with a gentleness that immediately eased her anxiety, noticing details without commenting on them, treating the space not as something to be inspected but respected. And when he offered to help with a loose cabinet door and a flickering porch light, small tasks her husband had once handled without thought, Margaret felt a tightening in her chest that surprised her with its intensity, not because Ethan was doing something remarkable, but because the act stirred a blend of gratitude and grief that had long coexisted quietly within her. And as he worked, she hovered nearby, making tea, watching the ease with which he focused, the way he explained what he was doing without condescension. And in that ordinary domestic moment, she felt the past and present touch without colliding. And later, when they sat at the kitchen table eating a simple meal she had prepared, conversation flowed more deeply than before, moving beyond shared interests into shared vulnerabilities. Margaret speaking aloud fears she had rarely articulated, the fear of becoming invisible with age. The fear that her capacity for love might be seen as inappropriate or foolish. The fear that she might one day wake up and regret allowing herself to feel again. And Ethan listened. His response, not an attempt to fix or reassure too quickly, but an acknowledgement of her courage in naming those fears. And he spoke honestly about his own uncertainties, about navigating a world that often rushed intimacy while fearing depth, about his desire for connection rooted in presence rather than projection. And these conversations continued into quiet evenings. Some spent cooking together and laughing over small mistakes. Others spent simply sitting, the television off. The space between them filled not with tension but with comfort. And Margaret noticed how natural it felt to share silence again. How different it was from the lonely quiet she had grown accustomed to. And yet, as their bond deepened, the world outside her home began to intrude more noticeably. Neighbors offering curious glances, acquaintances asking pointed questions thinly veiled as concern. And though no one spoke outright disapproval, Margaret felt the weight of unspoken judgment pressing in, reigniting insecurities she thought she had resolved. And there were moments when she questioned whether she was strong enough to carry not only her own feelings but the interpretations of others. And one afternoon, after overhearing a whispered comment at the market, she returned home shaken, the old instinct to retreat resurfacing, telling her that invisibility might be easier than explanation. And it was then that she finally voiced her doubts to Ethan directly, confessing her fear that she was asking too much of him by remaining in something so publicly scrutinized, that she worried he might one day feel burdened by her history, her age, her complicated life. And in response he took her hand with quiet certainty and told her something that stayed with her long after the words were spoken. That he was not trying to replace anyone from her past. That he did not see her history as something to overcome but as something that had shaped the woman he admired. That what drew him to her was not her loneliness but her fullness. The way she engaged with the world, the wisdom she carried without bitterness, the humor that emerged even from sorrow, and as he spoke, Margaret felt a release she had not realized she was holding back, a loosening of the idea that love had to erase what came before in order to exist. And that night, alone again in her house, she allowed herself to grieve not only what she had lost years ago, but what she had denied herself since. The possibility of being chosen, again not out of necessity, but desire. And she understood that embracing this connection did not diminish the love she had known, but honored it by proving that her heart had learned from it rather than closed because of it. And in the days that followed, she moved with greater confidence, no longer hiding her meetings with Ethan, no longer minimizing the importance of what they shared. And though uncertainty remained, it no longer dominated her thoughts, replaced instead by a growing commitment to live honestly within the present she had been given. Even if it meant facing discomfort, because for the first time in years, she felt not like someone preserving the past, but someone actively participating in her own life. Aware that whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer merely surviving them, but choosing them with intention. By the time Margaret decided to invite Ethan to Sunday lunch with her family, the decision felt less like a leap and more like a necessary crossing. As though she had reached a point where remaining hidden would cost her more than stepping into uncertainty. And yet on the morning of the gathering her hands trembled slightly as she set the table. The familiar rituals of preparation suddenly heavy with meaning. Because this was not merely about introducing a companion, but about asserting a truth she had only recently begun to claim for herself. That her life was still unfolding, and when Ethan arrived, he did so with the same quiet attentiveness that had come to define his presence in her world, carrying a modest dessert he had baked himself, greeting her with warmth that steadied her nerves rather than inflaming them. And as her children and grandchildren filled the house with noise and movement, Margaret watched closely, her awareness sharpened, noticing how Ethan listened more than he spoke at first. How he addressed her children with respect, rather than defensiveness. How he knelt to speak to the grandchildren at eye level, inviting their stories as though they mattered as much as any adult conversation. And slowly the initial stiffness in the room began to soften, laughter emerging tentatively, then more freely. As shared moments accumulated, a spilled drink turned into a joke. A story from Ethan about his own childhood prompted smiles, and Margaret felt a cautious hope take root, though beneath it lay a current of tension she knew could not be avoided forever. And that tension surfaced later, when the dishes were cleared and conversation settled into quieter tones. And Claire finally voiced what had been building within her. Her words careful but charged with emotion, expressing concern not out of judgment but fear that her mother might be hurt, that she might be idealizing something that could not last, that the imbalance of age and circumstance might leave her vulnerable. And Margaret listened without interruption, recognizing the love beneath the worry, yet also feeling the familiar sting of being spoken about rather than spoken to. And before she could respond, Ethan spoke, his voice calm and measured, acknowledging Claire's concern without dismissing it, explaining that he did not see Margaret as someone to rescue or protect, but as someone he respected deeply, someone whose life experience enriched rather than complicated his own. And he made it clear that he did not seek to rewrite her past or isolate her from her family, but hoped instead to be welcomed into the life she had already built. And as he spoke, Margaret felt something settle firmly within her. A clarity that had been forming slowly, now crystallizing. And she realized that this moment was not about convincing anyone else as much as it was about affirming herself. And so she spoke too, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment, telling her children that she understood their fears, that she shared some of them herself, but that she could no longer live as though safety were the highest form of love, that she had honored her marriage, her grief, and her responsibilities, but that she was also allowed joy, connection, and growth, even now, especially now. And she explained that what she shared with Ethan did not erase her past but existed alongside it. adding dimension rather than replacing meaning. And as she spoke, she felt the power of claiming her own narrative, of choosing not to shrink her life to fit others' comfort. And the room grew quiet, not with tension but with processing, the kind of silence that follows honesty rather than conflict. And eventually Claire reached for her hand. Her expression softened by understanding even if uncertainty remained. And in that gesture, Margaret felt acceptance not as immediate agreement, but as willingness. A door left open rather than closed, and the rest of the afternoon unfolded with a gentler ease. Conversations resuming, children playing, the ordinary rhythms of family life reasserting themselves. And when Ethan later thanked her for trusting him enough to include him, Margaret realized that this, too, was a form of courage, allowing the people she loved to see her as she was now, rather than who they expected her to be. And that evening, after everyone had gone and the house returned to its familiar quiet, she sat alone for a moment, reflecting not with exhaustion, but with a sense of grounded peace, aware that challenges would continue, that acceptance might be gradual and incomplete, but confident now that she was no longer willing to abandon herself for the sake of appearing unchanged, because life had already changed her, and she had finally chosen to meet that change with openness rather than fear. In the months that followed that pivotal Sunday afternoon, Margaret's life settled not into certainty, but into something far more sustaining, a gentle rhythm shaped by choice rather than habit. And she found that embracing joy did not arrive as a sudden transformation, but as a series of small, deliberate acts that accumulated meaning over time. Quiet mornings where she and Ethan walked through the neighborhood as the world slowly woke around them, their conversations unhurried, sometimes thoughtful and sometimes playful. Evenings spent cooking simple meals that turned into shared rituals rather than performances. Museum visits where they wandered without agenda, allowing curiosity to guide them. And through these moments, Margaret noticed how her sense of self continued to expand, not by becoming someone new, but by reclaiming parts of herself she had set aside. The woman who laughed easily, who debated ideas passionately, who felt inspired to create again, and she returned to her small studio space, dusting off brushes that had not been used in years, painting not with the expectation of producing something remarkable, but with the simple pleasure of expression. And Ethan watched her with quiet admiration, offering encouragement without intrusion, understanding that this resurgence belonged to her. And when her grandchildren visited, they found her more present, more playful, baking with them, listening to their stories with genuine attention, no longer distracted by the weight of loneliness she had carried for so long. And Margaret observed how love, in this new form, did not isolate her from the rest of her life, but wove itself through it, strengthening her relationships rather than competing with them. And even moments of doubt, which still surfaced from time to time, no longer felt like threats, but reminders of how deeply she cared. And when neighbors whispered or acquaintances questioned her choices, she found herself less reactive, less inclined to explain or defend, because the validation she once sought externally had begun to root itself internally, grounded in the knowledge that she was living honestly, rather than cautiously. And there were evenings when she sat alone on the porch after Ethan had gone home, watching the sky change color as the sun dipped below the horizon. And she felt a peace that surprised her, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was fuller than the peace she had once known, layered with gratitude rather than resignation. And she often thought of her husband during these moments, not with guilt, but with warmth, imagining him smiling at the way her life had unfolded, trusting that the love they had shared had prepared her rather than confined her. And as seasons changed, Margaret became increasingly aware that the greatest gift this chapter had given her was not romance alone, but permission. Permission to remain open, to continue growing, to believe that meaning did not diminish with age but deepened. And she and Ethan never rushed to define their future in rigid terms, understanding instead that what they shared thrived in presence rather than projection. And that choice itself felt radical in a world so often obsessed with certainty. And on one quiet evening, as they sat side by side watching the last light fade, their hands resting together without urgency, Margaret felt a profound clarity settle over her. The understanding that life did not follow a timetable and love did not arrive according to rules. That joy was not a reward for youth, nor a consolation for loss, but a living force that met the heart when it was willing to receive it. And she smiled then, not because everything was resolved or guaranteed, but because she was fully there, fully alive in the moment she was given. And she understood that the stranger she had once met among fallen books had not changed her life by rescuing her or redefining her, but by reminding her of something she had always known and temporarily forgotten: that the heart does not age the way the body does, and that the greatest adventures often arrive quietly, asking not for certainty, but for courage. And as the evening settled into night, Margaret leaned into the stillness with gratitude, knowing that whatever days lay ahead, she would meet them not as someone waiting for life to end gently, but as someone who had chosen, even at 67, to begin again.